My daughter called me at precisely 3:14 in the morning. Her voice was a cracked, desperate whisper that cut through the darkness of my bedroom like a shard of broken glass. "Dad, save me. Please." There, and then the line went dead. There was no dial tone, no static, just a sudden, suffocating silence that made the blood in my veins turn to absolute ice. I didn't hesitate. I didn't waste a single second trying to call back or calling the authorities. Because a father who has spent 40 years working in heavy industrial construction knows that when a load-bearing structure is about to collapse, you don't stand around waiting for an inspection team. You move. I threw on my heavy denim work jacket, grabbed my keys, and ran out into the freezing, rain-swept night. The cold October wind hit my face like a physical blow, carrying the sharp scent of damp earth and incoming storm. I climbed into the cabin of my heavy Ram 3500 dually truck, the massive turbodiesel engine roaring to life with a menacing, deep-throated growl that rattled the windows of my quiet suburban street. My mud-stained leather work boots slammed down on the gas pedal, and the heavy iron beast surged forward into the dark, slick streets. I had spent half of my life suspended on scaffolding high above the icy, gray waters of the bay, checking for stress fractures in solid iron rivets, and recalculating the load limits of old railway crossings that had been battered by a century of heavy cargo trains. I knew exactly how a tiny, invisible bubble in a steel weld could slowly propagate under the rhythmic, daily pounding of traffic, eventually leading to a catastrophic structural failure. I was a man of concrete, steel, and mathematical certainty, and my entire life had been governed by the strict, unforgiving laws of gravity and tension. But for all my mechanical expertise, for all my ability to predict the physical breaking points of cold metal, I had been completely blind to the fact that the moral structure of my daughter's new family was rotting from the inside out. My destination was the lavish Sterling estate, a sprawling, 50-acre fortress of brick and wrought iron, perched high on the cliffs of Newport, Rhode Island. It was a monument to old money and high society arrogance, built with the generational wealth of the Sterling Marine Transportation Group. But tonight, that mansion had become a prison for my only child, Sienna. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab yourself a warm cup of coffee, a few snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing. They simply chose the path of vanity and cruelty instead. Leave a comment with the number 1 in the section below so we can keep our family of listeners growing. And make sure to hit that subscribe button. You are going to absolutely enjoy the sheer, unyielding justice in this one. As my truck tore up the winding private asphalt road leading to the estate, the towering wrought iron security gates came into view. They were 12 feet high, decorative, and worth at least $25,000, locked tight with heavy electronic deadbolts, designed to keep the working-class world far away from their pristine sanctuary. Margaret Sterling, my daughter's haughty mother-in-law, stood on the grand second-floor balcony overlooking the driveway. Even at this ungodly hour, she was dressed in a pristine emerald-green silk robe, a half-empty glass of vintage Burgundy wine resting elegantly in her manicured hand. When she saw the blinding halogen headlights of my truck illuminating the manicured hedges, she didn't look worried. She merely looked down at me with the quiet, devastating contempt she had always reserved for a man who earned his living with calloused hands and dusty boots. She pressed the intercom button near the double front doors. Her voice came through the gate speaker, sharp, metallic, and dripping with condescension. "Silas Vance," she sneered, her words cutting through the rain. "Turn your loud, rusted machine around and leave immediately. Your daughter is having another one of her unstable, hysterical episodes. She is currently asleep under medical supervision, and absolutely no one is permitted to disturb her. I have already instructed our private security detail to have you removed for trespassing if you do not leave this property in 30 seconds. I didn't argue. I didn't waste my breath shouting threats or pleading for entry. A man who has spent his life leveling foundations and tearing down structurally unsound buildings understands that dialogue is useless when a barrier stands between you and your child. I shifted the heavy truck into reverse, backing up exactly 30 feet along the gravel driveway. I looked Margaret straight in the eye through the rain-streaked windshield. The absolute, unyielding calmness of a man who had faced down collapsing trenches and crane failures kept my hands perfectly steady on the leather steering wheel. I floored the accelerator. The massive turbodiesel engine shrieked, the tires burning rubber against the wet asphalt, filling the cold night air with thick, acrid smoke. The truck surged forward like a battering ram of solid iron. A thunderous, deafening crash shattered the quiet night. The $25,000 decorative gates buckled violently under the 3-ton impact, the solid iron bars snapping like dry twigs as the electronic locks exploded in a shower of blue sparks. The front grille of my truck crumpled, the radiator hissing with escaping steam, and the windshield spiderwebbed into a map of fractures. But the barrier was gone. The path was wide open. I threw the door open, stepped out into the pouring rain, and walked toward the grand mahogany double doors of the mansion. My heavy leather boots, caked in mud, left dark, wet prints across the pristine white marble porch. 3 private security guards stepped into the entryway, their hands hovering near their belts, but when they looked into my eyes, they stopped. They didn't see an angry, screaming man. They saw a father who had left his capacity for fear behind in the gravel. My absolute silence was far more terrifying than any weapon. I shoved past the butler who tried to block the foyer, my shoulder sending him spinning against a gilded pedestal table, and headed straight for the second floor. A father's raw instinct, honed by decades of protecting his family, guided me through the maze of carpeted corridors until I reached the master suite. I raised my boot and kicked the heavy carved oak bathroom door straight off its hinges. The door splintered inward, crashing onto the marble floor. What I saw inside made my chest tighten until I could barely breathe. Sienna, my brilliant, beautiful daughter, was lying curled up on the cold, gray marble floor of the master bathroom. Her face was a ghostly, pale mask, her eyes half open but dull, glassy, and completely lifeless. She was trembling uncontrollably, her fingers twitching against the stone. On the counter beside her lay a discarded, clinical syringe, still wet with a trace of a clear, heavy chemical liquid. They had drugged my child. They had turned a brilliant, independent young woman who had graduated at the top of her university class into a helpless, unresponsive shell. A wave of pure, concentrated rage rose from the very depth of my soul. But it did not make me scream. It crystallized into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. The Sterlings were incredibly wealthy. They were politically connected, and they believed they owned this city. But they had made a fatal, irreversible mistake. They had laid their dirty hands on Silas Vance's daughter. Margaret Sterling stood in the doorway, her silk robe rustling, her face twisted in a mixture of outrage and sudden, creeping fear. "You are going to prison for this, Silas," she shrieked, her voice cracking as she pointed a trembling finger at me. "This is home invasion. This is grand larceny. I've already called the police, and they will ensure you rot in a concrete cell for the rest of your pathetic, miserable life." I didn't say a single word. I didn't look at her. I gently lifted Sienna into my arms. She felt entirely weightless, like a bird with broken wings. I wrapped her tightly in my heavy denim jacket and carried her past her mother-in-law. The expensive, suffocating French perfume Margaret wore could not cover the smell of the moral rot that filled the room. The war had officially begun. They had millions of dollars. But I had my own unyielding sense of justice, and a community of men who knew exactly how to level a foundation. The wail of police sirens began as a distant, high-pitched scream, echoing off the harbor cliffs, before growing into a deafening roar that filled the rainy night. As I walked out of the Sterling mansion, carrying Sienna's limp, shivering body in my arms, the gravel driveway erupted into a sea of flashing red and blue lights. 4 patrol cars spun around the broken wrought iron gates, kicking up wet gravel as they boxed in my crumpled jewelry truck. 10 uniformed officers sprang from their vehicles, their service weapons drawn and pointed directly at my chest. Step away from the vehicle. Put the woman down and raise your hands, a sergeant screamed through a bullhorn, his voice distorted by the rain and wind. I didn't run. I didn't panic. I slowly and gently laid Sienna across the spacious leather back seat of my truck, covering her with a dry wool blanket I kept in the cab. Her breathing was shallow, her lips bruised and blue. The moment I closed the truck door, a young, eager officer rushed forward, grabbed my arm, and roughly slammed my face against the hood of my truck. The metal was still boiling hot, the smell of burnt coolant and rubber rising into my nostrils as they twisted my arms behind my back and tightened the cold steel handcuffs around my wrists. Alistair Sterling, my daughter's father-in-law and the wealthy CEO of Sterling Marine Transportation, stepped out onto the marble porch. He adjusted the collar of his expensive wool coat, standing beside his wife Gwendolyn. He looked at me with the absolute satisfaction of a predator who believed he had just walked his prey straight into a steel trap. He walked down the steps with slow, deliberate strides, his designer leather shoes completely clean of the mud that covered my boots. "Look at this pathetic, destructive animal," Alistair said to the police sergeant, his voice dripping with arrogance. "He smashed through my gates, assaulted my staff, and tried to kidnap my daughter-in-law under the cover of night. I want this trash locked away in the deepest cell you have. Ensure he never sees the light of day again." They shoved me into the back of a patrol car and drove me to the Central Newport police station. It was a cold, gray concrete structure, and they pushed me into a dark interrogation room with a rusted steel table and two metal chairs. My hands remained cuffed tightly behind my back. I sat there in complete silence for 3 hours. I didn't ask for a lawyer. I didn't beg for water, and I didn't utter a single syllable to the guards standing at the door. I simply waited, analyzing the structural cracks in their arrogance. The door swung open, and Alistair Sterling stepped inside, flanked by Chief Cassian Sinclair, the corrupt head of the local police department, who had been on Alistair's corporate payroll for over a decade. Sinclair was a man whose expensive suits and luxury watches were bought entirely with the blood money of Alistair's bribes, a corrupt official who had spent his career turning a blind eye to the Sterling family's illegal maritime smuggling and financial fraud. Alistair pulled out the metal chair across from me, sat down with a smirk, and threw a stack of printed repair invoices onto the table. "Your worthless truck and your entire miserable life aren't worth a single corner of my decorative iron gates, Silas." Alistair laughed, leaning forward until I could smell the expensive tobacco on his breath. "You're nothing but an old, uneducated construction laborer who thinks he can stand against the Sterling family. By the time my legal team is finished with you, you'll be bankrupt, homeless, and rotting in a state penitentiary. And as for your precious Sienna, we have already signed the preliminary petition to declare her mentally incompetent. We're going to have her permanently committed to a private psychiatric asylum, and we will take absolute sole custody of your grandson, Leo. You will never see either of them again." I lifted my head, my eyes locking onto his smug, arrogant face. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue or show a single trace of the rage that was burning inside me. I spoke in a low, level voice that made the room feel 20 degrees colder. "I didn't spend my 40-year career building luxury beach houses for spoiled, corrupt parasites like you, Alistair," I said quietly, my gaze boring into his. "I built the very concrete municipal police station you are sitting in right now. I laid the steel rebar in this foundation with my own calloused hands. I poured the high-pressure concrete that forms these walls during the blizzard of '96. I know exactly how thick the rebar is, and I know exactly who paid for the plumbing. And more importantly, I know that every brick in this city has a story. You think your money has bought you this building, and you think your bribes have bought you Chief Sinclair's loyalty. But you're about to find out that when a structure is built on a foundation of lies, it only takes a single, calculated pull at the load-bearing pillar to bring the entire roof crashing down on your head. You think your money has bought you this city, but the foundation belongs to me." Alistair's smug smile slowly froze. He opened his mouth to deliver another arrogant threat, but before he could speak, Chief Sinclair's personal cell phone began to vibrate violently against the steel table. The chief answered it, his face instantly draining of all color as he listened to the voice on the other end. He looked at me with a sudden, overwhelming terror in his eyes. The heavy steel door of the interrogation room was violently shoved open, and a tall, well-dressed man in a sharp charcoal gray suit walked inside. It was Gideon Cross, my personal attorney, and the financial demolition of the Sterling family was about to begin. Gideon Cross did not look like a cheap lawyer who handled neighborhood disputes. He was a senior partner at the most powerful corporate litigation firm in the state, and he carried a thick, navy blue leather binder under his arm. Without a single word, he placed the binder onto the rusted steel table, the heavy impact echoing like a gunshot in the cramped interrogation room. Chief Sinclair hurriedly pulled a set of keys from his belt and unlocked my handcuffs, his hand shaking so badly that he dropped the keys twice onto the concrete floor. Alistair Sterling sprang to his feet, his face twisted in a mixture of confusion and fury as he glared at Gideon. "Who the hell are you? And how did you get authorization to barge into a secured police interrogation?" Alistair demanded, trying to find his lost composure. "I am Alistair Sterling. My company, Sterling Marine Transportation, practically runs the commerce of this harbor. You and your client are going to be crushed by my legal team." Gideon Cross didn't even look at Alistair. He respectfully nodded to me, pulled out a gold-plated pen from his pocket, and flipped open the blue leather binder. "Mr. Vance, I have completed the emergency asset audit as requested," Gideon said in a cool, professional voice. "And we are ready to proceed with the primary foreclosure filings." Alistair let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Foreclosure? On me? You're completely insane. My shipping group is worth tens of millions of dollars. We have prime real estate, a massive fleet of transport vessels, and the full backing of the municipal banks. A dusty construction worker and a pretentious suit can't touch a single dollar of my family's legacy." I stood up, slowly stretching my back after 3 hours of being cuffed to the metal chair. I rubbed my wrists, feeling the cold air of the room, and walked closer to Alistair. My dusty, mud-stained leather work boots carried me to within inches of his face. He flinched slightly, taking a step backward against the wall, but I kept my eyes fixed on him, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "You're right about one thing, Alistair," I said softly, my voice carrying the weight of a stone. "Your shipping empire was worth tens of millions of dollars, but what you didn't know is that for the past 8 months, your useless degenerate son Tristan has been secretly burning through your company's capital. He lost over $6 million in highly volatile, illegal offshore cryptocurrency accounts, and he became deeply indebted to dangerous, international organized crime syndicates who were threatening to burn your entire fleet to the ground. To save his own skin, Tristan forged your signature on corporate deeds and transfer papers, pledging 70% of your shipping vessels as collateral to a private investment group." Alistair's eyes widened, his lips trembling as he stared at me. That's a lie. Tristan is my chief financial officer. He would never." "He did," Gideon Cross interrupted, sliding a series of certified financial ledgers and loan agreements across the table. "And to cover his massive debts, Tristan took out high-interest, predatory commercial loans from a private maritime holding fund named Aegis Capital Partners, using 70% of your shipping vessels and your Grand Newport estate as collateral. And Alistair, Mr. Silas Vance is the sole owner of Aegis Capital Partners. He has spent the last 30 years quietly buying up the distressed commercial debt of this harbor, investing the profits from his construction firm into your unsecured liabilities." Alistair gasped for air, his hand grabbing the back of his chair for support. "No, no, that's impossible. Silas is a contractor. He works on concrete foundations. And I know exactly how to buy the dirt beneath your feet," I replied quietly. "The moment you signed that petition to have my daughter drugged and committed, you triggered the default clause in your son's loan agreement. Legally, I have the absolute, non-negotiable right to seize every single asset owned by Sterling Marine Transportation, including your luxury fleet, your bank accounts, and your Newport mansion. I can foreclose on your entire existence whenever I choose. I have already contacted the primary lenders, the Federal Maritime Licensing Board, and your lead shareholders. They are currently pulling their capital from your accounts to protect themselves from the fallout of your son's fraud. I can destroy your entire world with a single signature. And Alistair, I choose today. At that exact second, Alistair's personal phone began to vibrate non-stop, the screen lighting up with frantic, high-priority alerts from his board of directors, the municipal banks, and his primary shareholders. The dominoes were falling, and his entire empire of vanity was collapsing in real time. He stared at his phone, then up at me, his face turning from a bright, arrogant red to a ghostly, sickly pale. He looked at me as if he were staring at a monster, a silent, working-class monster who had just pulled the foundation out from beneath his feet. I turned my back on him, walked out of the interrogation room, and stepped into the main lobby of the precinct. The heavy glass doors opened, and the cold, crisp morning air of dawn filled my lungs. Gideon walked beside me, his expression grim. "Silas," Gideon murmured quietly, "our private investigator, Detective Briggs, has just uncovered another shocking piece of evidence. The Sterling family's conspiracy against Sienna wasn't just about her grandmother's land. They are hiding something far, far worse. A crime so terrible that it will send their entire bloodline to federal prison for the rest of their natural lives." Detective Briggs was waiting beside my truck, leaning against the crumpled passenger door with a thick, heavy manila folder tucked tightly under his arm. The rain had slowed to a freezing, miserable drizzle, and the morning sun was struggling to cut through the heavy gray coastal fog. I climbed into the cab of my truck, and Briggs slid into the passenger seat beside me. The tension in his jaw was impossible to miss. Briggs opened the folder, revealing a series of highly confidential police reports, forensic toxicology analysis sheets, and stamped court records. "Silas," Briggs began, his voice low and heavy with disgust, "the glamour and wealth of the Sterling family is nothing but a cheap coat of paint. Their shipping company was already hollowed out by Tristan's gambling debts. He owed millions to international loan sharks who were threatening his life. But they found a way to save themselves. Sienna's late grandmother, Clara, had left her a pristine, prime coastal parcel of land on Newport Harbor worth over $12 million. I gripped the leather steering wheel, my knuckles turning white as I stared out at the gray, misty road ahead. "They wanted the land," I said quietly. "Yes." Briggs nodded, "but they couldn't just ask her to sign it over. Sienna was too smart. She knew Tristan was untrustworthy and refused to let him touch her grandmother's legacy, so they devised a monstrous, calculated scheme. They bribed a private psychiatrist, Dr. Evans, to write false medical records claiming Sienna was suffering from severe paranoid schizophrenia. Then, they began systematically poisoning her. Every day, they secretly injected her with high doses of a powerful, restricted sedative called haloperidol, the clear liquid in the syringe you found in the bathroom. They wanted to turn her into a drooling, unresponsive vegetable, so they could legally petition for guardianship and seize control of her $12 million land. A dark, cold rage flared behind my eyes, but I kept my breathing slow and steady. "But there's more, isn't there, Briggs?" Gideon mentioned a crime. Briggs took a deep breath, turning to a set of crime scene photographs in the folder. 6 months ago, during a violent, blinding rainstorm on Route 7, Tristan was driving home completely drunk after losing a massive bet. He was speeding, his sports car aquaplaned, and he struck a 34-year-old construction worker crossing the road. The impact was horrific, throwing the poor man nearly 30 feet into the wet brush. Tristan panicked. He called his father, Alistair. Alistair arrived 15 minutes later, bringing Chief Sinclair with him in an unmarked police vehicle. Briggs pointed to a confidential medical examiner's report. "The victim was still alive, Silas. He was barely breathing, his chest rising and falling, as he tried to beg for help in the mud. But instead of calling an ambulance, Alistair Sterling looked at Chief Sinclair and coldly ordered him to help Tristan drag the living, struggling man into a deep, remote ravine on the side of Route 7, leaving him to suffocate and die in the dark. They erased the skid marks, washed the blood from the asphalt, and buried the crime scene. I closed my eyes, my heart aching as I pictured the sheer, unadulterated evil of that moment. And Sienna, I whispered. Sienna was in the passenger seat of Tristan's car, Briggs said, his voice trembling with anger. She witnessed the entire murder. She screamed and tried to run out to help the dying man, but Tristan held her back. Afterward, Alistair Sterling approached her. He placed a cold, loaded pistol against her temple and forced her to sign a false confession, admitting that she was the one who had been driving the car that night, threatening that if she ever spoke a single word of the truth, they would have me murdered and make it look like a construction accident. Sienna endured the psychological torture and the drugging to protect my life. But even that wasn't enough to satisfy their greed. They feared that one day the guilt would consume her and she would confess. That's why they decided to erase her mind permanently with the sedatives. The silence in the truck cab was heavy, terrifying, and absolute. The Sterling family was not merely a group of greedy, high society snobs. They were cold-blooded murderers. They had treated the life of an honest working-class man as if it were nothing but garbage, and they had brutally tortured my daughter to protect their corrupt bloodline. They had made the greatest mistake of their lives. They had forgotten that a father who spent his life building structures with his hands also knew exactly how to dismantle them. Briggs, I said, my voice as cold as a steel blade, I am going to destroy them. Not just in a courtroom, and not just in a bank ledger. I am going to strip away their pride and expose their disgusting, rotting souls in front of the very high society crowd they worship most. Briggs looked at me, a sudden chill running down his spine. What's the plan, Silas? Tonight, the Sterling family is hosting their grand annual charity gala at the five-star Bellevue Hotel, I replied, starting the truck's engine with a menacing growl. They believe they are going to use the event to attract new investors and hide their financial decay behind crystal chandeliers and champagne. We are going to attend, and we are bringing them a surprise they will never forget. The grand ballroom of the five-star Bellevue Hotel was a glittering sea of crystal chandeliers, gold-plated decor, and expensive designer clothing. The city's wealthy elite mingled, sipping champagne and laughing as a classical orchestra played softly in the background. At the center of the room stood Alistair and Margaret Sterling, smiling and holding court like royalty, desperately trying to project an image of untouchable power and wealth to hide the financial ruin collapsing behind their backs. Every socialite in Newport was there, dressed in their finest silks and velvets, completely oblivious to the fact that the entire Sterling empire was a hollowed-out shell, held together by nothing but lies and stolen capital. The massive mahogany double doors of the ballroom swung open. I walked inside. I was dressed in a custom-tailored, flawless black wool tuxedo, my posture upright, my steps slow and commanding. There was no old pickup truck, no mud-stained denim jacket, and no dusty work boots. My presence instantly commanded the attention of the room, and heads turned as I walked across the polished marble floor. The sheer contrast between my hard-weathered face and the soft, pampered expressions of the high society crowd was striking. Yet my absolute calmness radiated an undeniable authority that silenced the whispers around me. Margaret Sterling spotted me from across the ballroom, and the crystal glass of red wine in her hand trembled so violently that a few dark red drops spilled onto her white silk dress. A sudden, cold terror flashed across her face before she quickly forced her mask of high society arrogance back into place. She walked over, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, and leaned close to my ear, her voice a venomous, quiet hiss. "How dare you sneak into this hotel, Silas?" she sneered, her eyes blazing with hatred. "This is a private, exclusive event for people of actual class and fortune. You are nothing but a common laborer who belongs in a ditch. If you don't turn around and leave immediately, I will have the hotel security guards throw you out into the street like the stray dog you are." At that exact second, a young, hard-working waitress named Amelia, who was carrying a silver tray of water glasses, accidentally bumped into Margaret's arm in the crowded room, causing a few drops of cold water to spill onto Margaret's sleeve. Margaret exploded with a sudden, vicious rage. She swung her manicured hand and violently slapped Amelia across the face, the loud, sharp crack echoing through the immediate area of the ballroom. "You clumsy, worthless, pathetic little girl," Margaret shrieked, her face contorted in an ugly mask of fury. "Do you have any idea how much this designer silk dress costs? Your entire family couldn't earn enough in a year to pay for a single thread of it." "Get out of my sight!" Amelia burst into tears, her face flushing a deep, painful red as she knelt on the floor to pick up the spilled glasses, repeatedly apologizing through her sobs. The wealthy guests standing around them merely watched in cold, indifferent silence, completely unbothered by the brutal cruelty on display. I stepped forward. I slowly knelt down beside Amelia, helped her back to her feet, and took the heavy silver tray from her trembling hands. I looked directly into Margaret's eyes, my face completely calm. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I acted. The annual charity auction began, and the highlight of the evening was the sterling star sapphire, a legendary, deep blue gemstone heirloom, passed down through 4 generations of the Sterling family. Alistair stood on the elevated stage, proudly presenting the velvet-lined box containing the sparkling gem. He announced the opening bid at $100,000, hoping to use the proceeds to cover Tristan's debts and buy some breathing room from his creditors. The room fell into an uneasy silence. No one wanted to place a bid, as rumors of the Sterling family's impending bankruptcy had already begun to circulate among the elite. I raised my hand. $200,000. A gasp of astonishment swept through the ballroom. Alistair's eyes widened in shock, and Margaret froze where she stood near the stage. Another wealthy real estate investor, wanting to challenge me and impress Alistair, raised his paddle. 300,000. I didn't even blink. $450,000. The room erupted into frantic whispers. The auctioneer's gavel came down with 3 sharp, decisive knocks. The sterling star sapphire belonged to me. I walked onto the stage, took the velvet box from the stunned auctioneer, and turned back to the audience. I walked down the steps, directly to where Amelia was standing in the back of the room, drying her tears. I opened the velvet box and placed the $450,000 sapphire directly into her small, trembling hands. "This gift is compensation for the humiliation inflicted on you tonight by people who mistake a bank account for class," I said loudly, my voice echoing off the high plaster ceilings of the ballroom. Margaret's face drained of all color, and Alistair stood frozen on the stage, completely paralyzed in front of the city's entire upper class. Their pride had been brutally crushed beneath my feet, and their high society reputation was shattered forever. But as I walked out of the Bellevue Hotel, my phone vibrated with a message from Detective Briggs. It contained a photograph of a secure medical corridor. "Silas, they've moved her." Briggs's voice was tight with urgency when I answered. "Alistair used his connections to secretly transfer Sienna out of the city hospital an hour ago. They've taken her to Cascade Crest Sanitarium, a private, isolated psychiatric facility hidden deep within the pine forests of Oregon. They're trying to make her disappear before the federal prosecutors can take her statement about the Route 7 accident." I drove through the pitch-black night, the headlights of my Ram truck cutting through the dense, towering pine forests of the Pacific Northwest. The rain was coming down in sheets, slamming against the hood of my truck and making the massive conifers look like dark, silent sentinels guarding the secrets of the valley. My destination was Cascade Crest Sanitarium, a secluded, high-security psychiatric facility surrounded by 12-foot-high concrete walls and coils of razor-sharp barbed wire. The Sterling family believed they could use their money to lock my daughter away, in a dark corner of the world, where no one would ever find her. hoping that the dense fog of the forest would swallow her existence forever. They were dead wrong. I didn't bring weapons, and I didn't bring a gang of hired muscle. I brought something far more powerful: the law, backed by the cold, unyielding force of regulatory authority and financial leverage. Behind my truck were four unmarked SUVs carrying state health department investigators, county fire marshals, and federal medical compliance officers. Through the extensive corporate and municipal connections I had built over 40 years of constructing the state's infrastructure, I had initiated an immediate, high priority, unannounced safety and medical compliance inspection of the facility. I knew the county fire marshal because I had poured the foundation for his main station, and the state health inspector knew that my construction firm had built the very regional hospitals they managed. They knew that when Silas Vance raised a red flag, it was backed by solid, unshakable concrete. The heavy iron security gates of Cascade Crest were forced open under state authority. The chief medical director, Dr. Evans, ran out into the rainy courtyard, his face pale and contorted in panic. He tried to block our way with procedural excuses, claiming patient confidentiality and insisting that Sienna was receiving highly specialized psychiatric treatment that could not be interrupted. He was wearing an expensive, tailored white lab coat, but beneath it, his chest was heaving with terror as he realized his private playground of corruption was being dismantled. "Step aside, Dr. Evans," the lead federal compliance officer said coldly, flashing his badge. "We are conducting an emergency inspection. Any attempt to obstruct this investigation or delay our access to patient records will result in your immediate federal arrest for obstruction of justice." We marched through the sterile, white-tiled corridors of the facility, the heavy scent of antiseptic and bleach, doing nothing to hide the clinical cruelty of the place. I knew exactly where they would keep her. I headed straight for the maximum security wing, walked past the startled orderlies, and kicked open the heavy steel door of room 204. My heart shattered as I crossed the threshold. Sienna was lying on a narrow, rusted metal cot, her wrists and ankles bound tightly with heavy leather restraints, her eyes half open and glazed with a thick, suffocating fog of sedatives. She was shivering in the damp, unheated room, her lips blue, her forehead burning with a fever. I walked over, my hands perfectly steady as I pulled out my pocket knife and sliced through the thick leather straps, throwing them to the floor like the worthless garbage they were. I gently lifted her into my arms, wrapping her tightly in my heavy denim work jacket. She felt so incredibly light, as if her soul had been almost entirely drained away by their poison. The security guards and Dr. Evans could do nothing but watch in absolute, silent terror as the state investigators photographed the room, the leather restraints, and the medical charts showing the massive, unauthorized doses of haloperidol that had been administered without her consent. I carried Sienna out of Cascade Crest, my heavy boots striking the concrete like a rhythmic drum. I laid her gently across the spacious back seat of my truck, covering her with a thick, warm wool blanket. As my truck rolled down the dark, wet highway toward the safety of Newport, the cool night air began to slowly clear the fog of drugs from her mind. Her eyes slowly focused on my face, and she reached out, her small, trembling hand gripping the sleeve of my denim jacket with a desperate, white-knuckled strength. "Dad," she whispered, tears streaming down her pale cheeks as she began to sob. "You came for me. I thought I was going to die in that dark room. They told me you were dead, Dad. They told me you had been crushed in a construction accident." "I will always come for you, Sienna," I murmured, my voice thick with emotion as I held her hand. "No matter how thick the concrete is, and no matter how dark the forest is, I will always tear the walls down. You are safe now." She squeezed my hand with desperate strength, her chest heaving as she struggled to speak through her tears. "Dad, they lied about Route 7. It wasn't just a hit and run. The man Tristan hit. He was still breathing when they dragged him into the ravine. He was struggling, trying to beg Alistair for help in the mud. Tristan and Chief Sinclair wanted to call an ambulance, but Alistair looked at the man and said, 'If he lives, we're ruined. Drag him into the woods. They buried him alive, Dad. They murdered an innocent, struggling man just to protect Tristan's reputation. I couldn't stop them, Dad. Tristan held me in the car, and Alistair threatened to have you killed if I ever spoke. A cold, silent horror washed over me, my hands tightening around the steering wheel until the leather creaked under my fingers. Alistair Sterling and his corrupt allies were not just white-collar thieves. They were monsters who had crossed every boundary of human decency. But before I could speak, my phone suddenly rang. It was an unfamiliar blocked number. I pressed the speaker button, and a child's terrified, high-pitched scream cut through the cabin of the truck. "Grandpa, help me! Daddy is hurting me! Grandpa!" It was my 6-year-old grandson, Leo. Then came the frantic, unhinged laughter of Tristan Sterling. "Silas Vance!" Tristan shrieked, his voice cracked with desperate, drug-fueled madness. "You thought you won? You thought you could take my family's shipping company and lock my parents away? I have your precious grandson at the abandoned Vance Ironworks. I have gasoline, Silas. I have a lighter. I want $10 million in cash, and a private helicopter waiting at the docks in 30 minutes. If I don't see that chopper, I will burn this entire steel mill to the ground with your grandson inside." The line went dead, leaving only the sound of the rain slamming against the windshield. My truck tore through the night like a solid iron bullet, heading straight toward the old, abandoned Vance Ironworks on the edge of the harbor docks. It was a massive, rusted maze of corrugated sheet metal, towering cranes, and cold blast furnaces that had been silent and dark for 20 years. My grandson's life was hanging in the balance, and Tristan Sterling was a desperate, cornered rat with absolutely nothing left to lose, driven insane by his massive debts and his family's sudden, catastrophic collapse. I didn't call the corrupt local police. Instead, I reached for my Citizens Band radio on the dashboard and switched to the emergency channel used by truck drivers, crane operators, and heavy equipment haulers across the state. The community of hard-working, blue-collar men and women I had stood beside, built bridges with, and protected for 40 years. "This is Silas Vance," I said, my voice steady, calm, and clear through the crackling static. "My son-in-law, Tristan Sterling, has kidnapped my 6-year-old grandson, Leo, at the abandoned Vance Ironworks. He's armed, he's out of his mind, and he has threatened to burn the mill with the boy inside. I need help." The response was immediate, deafening, and absolute. Within 10 minutes, the quiet coastal night was shattered by the deep, thunderous roar of hundreds of diesel engines and the screaming blast of air horns. From every highway, every construction site, and every freight terminal in the county, massive 18-wheelers, dually trucks, cement mixers, and tow trucks came rumbling in like an invading army. They surrounded the entire Vance Ironworks complex, their blinding high-beam halogen headlights and utility searchlights flooding the dark, rusted steel structures with a brilliant, white light that made the night look like high noon. Every single entrance and exit of the industrial yard was sealed off with an impenetrable wall of solid steel and rubber. Tristan was trapped inside a cage of light. I walked into the abandoned steel mill alone, my heavy leather boots echoing coldly against the concrete floor littered with shattered glass, rusted iron rivets, and dry, decayed timber. Tristan stood on an elevated steel platform 30 feet in the air, his eyes wild, bloodshot and wide with madness, a loaded pistol pressed tightly against little Leo's head. Leo was crying, his small arms wrapped tightly around his knees, shivering in his pajamas. Tristan looked completely unhinged, his hands shaking as he smelled the end closing in around him, a red gasoline can sitting at his feet on the rusted metal grating. "Don't come any closer, Silas!" Tristan screamed, his voice cracking as he waved the gun wildly between Leo and me. "I want my money. I want my helicopter. I will pull the trigger. I swear to God I will. They're going to put me in prison forever. I have nothing left." I stopped at the base of the platform. I looked directly into the barrel of his gun, my face completely calm. I didn't scream, and I didn't show a single trace of fear. The calmer I remained, the more terrified Tristan became. "You've already lost, Tristan," I said, my voice as cold as ice. "Your family's shipping company is gone. Your bank accounts are frozen. Your parents are being arrested by federal agents as we speak. There is nowhere left for you to run. Put the gun down and let the boy go." Tristan let out a hysterical, broken shriek. In his blind, drug-fueled panic, his finger began to tighten against the trigger, his hand moving toward Leo's temple. I moved. A grandfather's raw, unyielding instinct drove me forward with impossible speed. I lunged up the steel steps, throwing my physical body directly between the barrel of the gun and my grandson. The gunshot exploded through the empty steel mill, the deafening crack splitting the darkness in two. The bullet slammed straight into my left shoulder, a white, hot, searing agony tearing through my flesh as blood began to pour through my denim jacket. I didn't cry out, and I didn't fall. The pain meant absolutely nothing to me. My remaining arm wrapped tightly around Leo, pulling him close to my chest as I shielded his small body with my own flesh. At that exact second, Gideon's elite private security team, who had slipped into the mill through the upper catwalks under the cover of the headlights' glare, stormed the platform with military precision. Within seconds, Tristan was disarmed, pinned to the steel floor, and his hands were bound in tight plastic zip ties. His pistol clattered away, with a metallic ring against the metal grating. He screamed helplessly as they dragged him down the steps into the brilliant, blinding glare of the waiting truck's headlights outside. I dropped to one knee on the concrete, holding Leo tightly against my chest, his small hands clutching my denim jacket as he sobbed in relief. "You're safe, Leo," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion as my blood dripped onto the stone beneath us. "Grandpa's got you. Nobody is ever going to hurt you again." But the final chapter of the Sterling family's destruction was still being written. Alistair Sterling had managed to escape his mansion before the federal agents could close in. He had fled to a private, secluded airfield on the edge of Newport, carrying a heavy, black leather suitcase handcuffed to his wrist, containing the family's final cash reserves, $3 million in gold bars, and the highly classified, incriminating corporate documents detailing their financial fraud and the Route 7 murder. The engines of his private jet were already screaming on the tarmac, preparing for takeoff to a non-extradition country in South America. Alistair stood on the wet asphalt, a smug, desperate smile on his face, as he looked toward the escape waiting ahead of him. Suddenly the runway erupted in the wail of federal sirens. 6 black SUVs spun onto the tarmac, completely boxing in the private jet. Officers with automatic rifles jumped out, their weapons pointed at the cockpit. The cabin door of the lead SUV opened, and Sienna stepped out into the cold morning air, her posture upright, her eyes sharp, clear, and filled with a cold, triumphant justice. Beside her stood the federal prosecutors holding Alistair's arrest warrants. Alistair dropped the suitcase, his knees buckling in absolute defeat as the cold steel handcuffs tightened around his wrists. The Sterling family's empire of vanity was officially dead, collapsed into the mud of their own greed. 6 months later, the storm had completely passed, and the physical wound in my left shoulder had healed into a thick, permanent scar. But the profound lessons of that night remained etched into my soul forever, a physical and spiritual reminder of the price of protecting one's family from the monsters of greed. Alistair, Gwendolyn, Tristan, and Chief Sinclair were all convicted in federal court of first-degree murder, kidnapping, signature forgery, and systematic elder abuse. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, their names erased from the high society pages they had sacrificed their humanity to maintain. They would spend the rest of their natural lives in concrete cells, surrounded by the very walls Alistair had believed he was above. Sienna now sat proudly in the top-floor executive office of the newly established Vance Shipping Group, managing the harbor's commerce with a gentle grace and a brilliant, sharp business mind. She had regained her confidence, her beautiful smile, and her independence, and the company was now thriving on a foundation of honesty and fair treatment for all its workers. The grand, ostentatious Sterling Manor on the cliffs was purchased and completely renovated by our corporate holdings. The vanity, cruelty, and greed that once filled its marble halls were gone forever. In their place, the mansion had been transformed into Clara's haven, a beautiful, safe sanctuary for abused women and children rebuilding their lives. The marble halls that once echoed with Margaret's cruel sneers now carried the sound of hope, healing, and restoration. My grandson Leo's laughter echoed through the grand courtyard where the heavy wrought iron gates had once crashed to the ground under the weight of my truck. He ran across the manicured lawn, playing with our old sheepdog, completely safe from the terror of his past. I stood by the tall glass window of the manor, watching a long line of 18-wheelers roll peacefully down the coastal highway under a bright autumn sun. My life as an old retired construction worker continued in its simple, quiet way. Through this painful, exhausting journey, I learned three profound lessons about life that I want to leave you with today. Lesson 1. Never mistake a parent's patience, silence, and unconditional love for weakness that can be exploited. A quiet father is not a helpless father. He is simply a man who is waiting, analyzing the structural cracks, and preparing to defend his family with absolute precision when the time comes. Lesson 2. Real power does not come from your wealth, your designer clothes, or the prestige of your home address. True power comes from the relationships you build with honest people, and the community of working-class men and women who are willing to stand shoulder to shoulder with you when everything is on the line. Lesson 3. Justice may arrive late. Kindness without boundaries of reinforced concrete is nothing more than unconditional surrender to the predatory forces of greed. Never apologize for standing up to protect your own blood, and never allow the tears of a manipulator to soften the steel of your resolve. And the roads may be incredibly dark and stormy, but when it finally comes, it settles every single account with absolute fairness. Never allow anyone to trample on the people you love, and never hand the keys to your life over to a parasite. Live an honest life, protect your family, and let the foundations stand firm. Thank you for joining us on Dad's Real Life Revenge. Don't forget to share your own thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And make sure to like and subscribe so you never miss another hard-earned lesson. I'll see you in our next story.